I promise this is not a video about true crime. Although I definitely have opinions on the topic, I would not consider myself in the true crime community at all, and most of my knowledge on famous cases comes from BuzzFeed Unsolved and the You're Wrong About podcast. But what I am pretty infatuated with is docudramas. I'm talking about dramatic, scripted adaptations of real life stories told in the short series format. Not a documentary, but not quite any old series or movie that claims to be based on a true story. You know those movies: biopics, courtroom dramas, stories about political intrigue, investigative journalism. Movies that claim to be based on real events range from Hidden Figures to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There are literally so many examples that I honestly think they might outnumber original movies that don't claim to be based on anything. And then there are the TV show equivalents, stuff like The Crown or Narcos, based on historical events and periods, but they usually don't present themselves as the real deal. Viewers largely expect a fictional story following only the broad strokes of real life. And perhaps most importantly, viewers watch with the expectation that they will be entertained, not educated. The docudrama is really a genre unto itself, a chimera born out of our culture's appetite for both entertainment and news. You might notice that most of the stories selected are pretty recent events, issues from within the last 10 years or so, sometimes even cases that are literally still ongoing. But there are also examples of docuseries based on events from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Even though they don't present themselves as docuseries, which have had their own meteoric rise in recent years, we tend to treat these series more or less like documentaries in the sense that we assume what happens in them is mostly what happens in real life, only with some editorializing.
There's parts that are fiction. There's characters that don't exist in real life, representing entire groups of people. And there are conversations that nobody could possibly know what exactly was said, private moments, and those have obviously been created for our entertainment.
Essentially, they're like historical reenactments of events with some creative liberties taken. Compare this to the fictional movies or shows based on true events, where we expect plenty of changes for the sake of drama and the narrative. With this subtle distinction in mind, I do wonder about the implications of having so many popular docudramas out there, especially about events so recent and relevant. I worry we have come to see viewing the docudrama on a particular subject as the equivalent of researching the subject. And this is all the more relevant when we're talking about topical, ripped from the headlines issues. Did you hear about what's going on with Elizabeth Holmes? Yeah, I watched the show on Hulu. So, people are watching shows about real events that are mostly true to life, and sure, they might get some small details wrong, but what does that really matter if the big picture is still accurate? Well, what if docudramas bias us so much we can't even view the big picture accurately anymore? If we start treating news as primarily entertainment, how can we be expected to differentiate between fact and fiction? And on the other hand, what if this medium could offer something beyond simply informational and entertainment value? What is the overlap between this and true crime? Strangely, most true crime fans seem to prefer their content a little truer, if not strictly more accurate. Documentaries on serial killers and disappeared persons are more common than the dramatized versions, and nonfiction YouTube channels and podcasts dedicated to the subject are wildly popular. There are some exceptions. The first season of the anthology series American Crime Story focused on the trials of O.J. Simpson for the murders of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman, which is one of the most talked about crimes and trials ever. But despite getting two Ted Bundy movies, each of which were met with heavy criticism and controversy, mind you, we did not get a series. We didn't get one on John Bonet, or Casey Anthony, or David Berkowitz, or John Wayne Gacy, or Jeffrey Dahmer, or the Richardson family, or the Menendez brothers. I'm not completely ruling out that we might get one in the future, but I think that is pretty telling that given how wildly popular true crime has been in recent years, we haven't gotten a docudrama on any of these stories yet. There could be several possible answers as to why. Maybe this content is considered too morbid for a lot of mainstream viewers to be into. Maybe filmmakers and platforms would consider it unethical to create a dramatic series based on these stories, like they're worried about glamorizing brutal serial killers or exploiting the deaths of their victims. But for whatever reason, doing all of those things is just a lot more palatable when it's at least presenting itself as the true, unadulterated story of how things went down. We can make ourselves think that it's not made purely to entertain, but rather to inform. With that in mind, what is the purpose of the docudrama then? Is it purely to entertain? You would think that if that were the case, then they would make even more changes for the sake of dramatization. I mean, why not be shameless? They could still present the story as being based on true events or inspired by them, and the same people interested in the subject matter would still want to watch the show, right? In my opinion, The docudrama is born out of our desire to know what people are talking about and genuinely understand the world, combined with our love for entertainment and easily digestible narratives. Of course, many real life events get the docuseries treatment, but I feel like there's something to adapting a true story into a dramatic show. I would suspect there's a huge portion of the population that's interested in true stories and recent events, but not into documentaries. Documentaries and docuseries might be too dense or poorly paced, or the simple fact that they're documentaries might put some people off in the same way that some people get turned off by foreign language films. Whether it's right or wrong, something being presented in a format that we are not as used to is a barrier to entry for a lot of people. But the docudrama is the perfect hybrid of the documentary and the dramatic fiction series. All the relevance to recent history that a documentary on the subject would give you, all the broad strokes of the real life story, but with the benefits of a traditional narrative structure, performances from recognizable actors, and creative licenses of a fictional screenplay.
News we want to get to out of California concerns the Elizabeth Holmes trial. The verdict is in.
There's no shortage of super successful docudramas that check these boxes. The most recent example that springs to my mind is The Dropout, the Hulu series about Elizabeth Holmes and her fraudulent company Theranos. This is a news story that is literally still ongoing, as in her sentencing date has not happened yet. The series came out in between her criminal trial and her sentencing trial. Now, as someone who watched the series with very little knowledge of Elizabeth Holmes or Theranos going in, I like to think that I now have a pretty good understanding of the story. Of course, I have to acknowledge that as a fictional series that delves into basically 20 years of a real person's life and has to decide how to portray all of these real life people, I am biased in my view of the real events of the show. Sure, I know the path of Holmes's life and the major events in the creation and fall of Theranos, and I believe that this does give context to the news stories about her and the company. But I also have a problem. When I imagine Holmes in my head, I don't think of her. I think of Amanda Seyfried as her. I think of her performance in which she portrayed Holmes as, from my perspective, a neurotic, manipulative, cold, egotistical, and maybe a little delusional person. Is this accurate? I don't know, because I don't know her, and anytime she's captured on camera, she is surely going to be putting on a performance, projecting the version of herself that she wants to be perceived. And if we were to ask anyone who knows her personally, they're definitely going to give us an answer that is biased in some way, especially given what is going on with her right now. When a journalist or a news reporter is delivering a segment or a short article about recent events, there is no need for character arcs or narrative structure. You just report what is going on. Obviously, you can be biased in how you report these events, but generally they don't need to be twisted to create a compelling human story. Longer investigative articles are an exception to this, as they require more of a narrative structure or at least a theme or a hook to keep the reader's attention, which weirdly makes them more similar to a nonfiction book in that way. But even then, they aren't given the leeway to straight up change facts or speculate to fit the story better like a docudrama can. So, who has the better understanding? The person who only watched the docudrama, like me, or the person who casually follows current events and knows the real details of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos? Obviously, the information included in a news story is more reliable, because even if they might get details wrong or be biased in how they present them, the news is expected to present the facts. Meanwhile, a docudrama is probably accurate in the broad strokes of what happened, but the smaller details are sketchier. Often the anecdotes lifted from real life are indistinguishable from those concocted by a writer. But a docudrama also has the advantage of empathy. While we all understand news stories to be about real people, it's sometimes adaptations like a TV series or a movie that makes them seem like real human beings rather than characters. The fact that actors are casted to play them humanizes them. We get a glimpse into their inner conflicts, their motivations, and their suffering that we don't see on CNN. I'm not saying that the docudrama treatment always ends up making a character look better, it just makes them look more human. Then, at the very least, when we see Elizabeth Holmes or someone else on our TV screen, we know that that's a real person we're talking about. It almost feels like we know them ourselves.
Beth Macy joins us now. She's a journalist and author of the best-selling book, Dopesick. The book inspired Hulu's new limited series.
But while Elizabeth Holmes is portrayed as a sympathetic, albeit not excusable figure in The Dropout, what happens when a docudrama just straight up makes a real-life person look terrible? Like, evil. Well, there's an example of that that's also pretty recent, and it's another Hulu series, Dopesick. This series includes a blend of real-life individuals portrayed by actors and made-up characters inspired by real people. In Dopesick, which deals with the origin of the opioid epidemic, several central characters are clearly portrayed as the villains of the story, most notably the Sackler family, the real-life family behind Purdue Pharma, which is probably the company most cited as responsible for the epidemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. And the series does not go easy on them, I will say. Pretty much any layperson would come away from the show believing that the Sacklers have blood on their hands, a take that the show is not shy about espousing either. We see the Sacklers clearly understood the risk of opioids and the damage that they were causing to real-life communities, and we see them choose time and time again to manipulate doctors, patients, and regulatory agencies to push their drugs and make as much money as possible doing it, a narrative which is supported by the facts of the case. Some people might interpret this bluntness as the show being unsympathetic in its treatment of the Sackler family, but I would not use that word. Sure, the Sacklers might come across as monsters, evil in the way that high society capitalist billionaires are, but hear me out. To view someone as a monster means to sympathize with them. Monsters require empathy. To see someone as a monster, we have to be able to imagine ourselves in their shoes and determine that we would never do what they did. We then reach the conclusion that they are worse people than us. And that's the key word there, people. While viewing people with empathy sometimes means giving them grace for their mistakes, it can also mean judging them even more harshly for the choices that they deliberately make. That's how we attribute malice to someone's actions. This is something that is just more difficult to do when we're only talking about someone, or hearing someone report on a story without ever hearing from the individuals that they're talking about, which is what we do when we watch the news most of the time.
An official announcement from the Council of Ministers. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station.
The examples I've given so far are all recent, relevant stories from the news, ripped from the headlines, you could say. But docudramas are also made about real-life events from history, When They See Us, Under the Banner of Heaven, and the example I want to talk about, Chernobyl. Everyone's probably heard about Chernobyl, if not seen it, since it was a super talked about show in 2019 and has felt uncomfortably applicable in the years since then. Personally, I agree with the take that it is one of, if not the greatest miniseries ever made, but I want to focus on some specific reasons why it slaps. As any review is bound to mention, the series uses a real historical event to ask questions and propose answers about current societal and political issues. The show manages to both educate the audience about the catastrophe and its impacts and encourage the audience to examine the topics of trust, lies, misinformation, and authority. While almost every docudrama is sure to have some thematic relevance beyond its immediate events, bigger issues like corporate greed or personal ambition, Chernobyl probably does it better than anyone else. Its messages ring extra true given the political climate it was released into, and even more true when another international public health emergency gripped the world soon after its release. The show expertly positions the Chernobyl nuclear disaster as almost a mirror of current-day disasters. Since it was made before the pandemic, the pertinent comparison was probably climate change. The explosion is treated as an existential threat to all of humanity, an emergency of epic proportions that you would think would supersede political squabbling, nationalistic attitudes, and international conflicts. Kind of like climate change, or a pandemic. It's the fact that this series takes a real-life example of this and asks us, this has happened in the past, and it's happening again now. What are we going to do this time? And honestly, the case of Chernobyl was a great example to use, because it could have gone a lot worse, but it also could have gone a hell of a lot better. The disaster directly killed thousands of people, injured and affected thousands and thousands of more, and did incalculable damage to the environment, all while the Soviet and Russian governments refused to take responsibility for the disaster and continuously downplayed it. It was a case of institutions and systems working against those trying to do their best to save us from ourselves.
One of the atomic reactors was damaged. The consequences of the accident are being taken care of. Help is being given to the victims of the accident. A government commission has been set up.
How will we do this time, Chernobyl asks. Will we trust the experts and scientists who promise us that something terrible is coming if we don't act? Do we seek out the few who tell us what we want to hear? Do we hide behind the authority figures who tell us everything is under control? Well, like the show, I'll leave you to determine how we're doing. Chernobyl brings a new dimension to the discussion of the docudrama. What if we could make a docudrama about a topic we otherwise would not be talking about, but informed by recent events? What if we create a masterful piece of art that anyone would be captivated by, but we use it as a vessel for deeper questions about current issues? Chernobyl is the 21st century equivalent of The Crucible, claiming to be about the grave mistakes of a previous generation, while not so subtly flipping the script and asking the audience to examine their own society. There are a lot of reasons why Chernobyl was critically acclaimed and honestly addicting to watch, but I do think the way it challenges its audience is one of the ways that it rose above every other piece of art to come out of the docudrama docuseries craze. And notably, it's something that I don't think would have hit nearly as hard if this series had been a documentary instead of a dramatized retelling.
Okay then, the Emmy for limited series goes to...
The way I see it, there are two main benefits to the art of the docudrama. The ability to empathize with the subjects more easily, and in the case of shows like Chernobyl, the ability to tie real-life events to greater issues and themes in society. But this method of understanding history or news clearly has its downsides too. Docudramas inject bias into our understanding of a real story. Sometimes our urge to empathize with someone could make us more skeptical or even hostile to facts or suggestions coming from other sources, those who theoretically know the facts a lot better than we do. Even if we try to do both, watch the dramatic adaptation of a story and get information from nonfiction sources, our view will almost definitely be skewed by the dramatic narrative. We humans are naturally drawn to narratives. They keep our attention, they entertain us, they evoke emotional responses, and above all, we're used to them. Even an expose in a newspaper or a documentary film will have some kind of narrative for us to wrap our brains around and keep us grounded. The most popular ones usually have the strongest narratives. Obviously, some people don't like TV shows or miniseries or movies at all, but that's rare. Our brains just like stories.
There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story.
While we can use this to our advantage by using the medium to tell stories about important issues or teach about real events, the downside is that the medium is so powerful it can make us more biased in our view of real life. Is the docudrama worth it then? Is it so inherently biased that we should assume we know nothing about a topic after watching the docudrama and treat it as nothing but entertainment? Should any person aiming to learn about an issue avoid watching docudramas entirely to spare themselves from the bias? Surprise, surprise, I don't think it's that cut and dry. We are all as biased as whatever source is reporting or adapting our news, and no such source is completely objective. But for all of the value offered by the docudrama when it comes to sympathy, empathy, compassion, and nuance, it's impossible to trust a piece of entertainment with little obligation to the truth to present the facts of a real-life story better than a news reporting can. So yes, if you want to understand a real-life story or event or person, if you plan on speaking about this topic as if you know anything about it, you should probably use some reputable nonfiction sources to educate yourself. But I don't think you necessarily have to swear off the docudrama. If we understand all news sources as having their own biases, but we accept a certain level of partiality, then I don't see why we can't add docudrama as another source of reporting. Yes, it's one with way more inherent bias because editorializing and building a narrative and constructing characters, yada yada, but I don't think we as humans are too dumb to understand that. We know that these shows are primarily entertainment, and it's not like it's impossible to discern the facts from the instances of creative license if you do a little bit more research outside of the show. Usually, as soon as a show like Chernobyl or The Dropout comes out, it's followed by some article listing the biggest things that the show got wrong or changed, or characters that were based on real people versus those that weren't. It is possible to watch a docudrama and still have a good understanding of the subject matter from research you did apart from the show. The docudrama will still bias you to a certain degree, but if you can't set that part of your brain aside when you need to, you can at the very least say, well, I saw the Hulu show, so I'm probably biased to a certain degree, but this is what I think about Elizabeth Holmes. What I am not sure about is how inevitable super strong bias is. Sure, we can never be totally objective. We will always approach situations from our own unique perspectives, which means that even if we receive the exact same information as someone else, we will still have different takeaways. But beyond the inherent issue in how humans perceive news, we have started to digest the real world in ways that are concerning. We view trials as soap operas, turn current events into memes, break news segments which are already truncated and simplified versions of complex issues into even smaller digestible clips, and then we share those on Twitter and repost screenshots of like the 8th tweet in a thread to Instagram without any other context, and make TikToks referencing testimonies delivered in court that very same day. Honestly, the docudrama seems like downright ethical journalism in comparison. I've been trying to think of a metaphor that captures the differences between a docudrama and any other fictional show, and it's honestly hard. But I think I've come to the conclusion that watching a docudrama is like eating carrot cake. On paper, it sounds like a more nutritious, healthier version of cake. Well, it's really not. It's not like there's a proper serving of veggies in a slice of carrot cake, or like it has any less sugar, butter, and such than a regular cake. But who cares? It tastes really good. The carrots add little nutrition, but bring texture, moisture, flavor. If you want to eat cake, who cares if it's nutritious or not? If you want to eat chocolate cake, eat chocolate cake. If you want to eat carrot cake, eat carrot cake. If you think vegetables have no place in any dessert, it's okay to say no to the carrot cake or the zucchini bread or whatever. But you probably wouldn't eat a carrot cake and think it has the same nutritional value as a serving of carrots. There's nothing wrong with consuming desserts as well as your vegetables or entertainment alongside your news. Just don't let entertainment be your news. Me personally, I think the best option is a healthy mix of nutritionally dense media and purely tasty entertainment, whether it be the docudrama or any other kind of fictional show. So the period of writing when I was trying to think of like the perfect metaphor to capture a docudrama actually went on for a really long time. Is it like Diet Coke? Is it like taking vitamin pills? Is it like spinach brownies? Because then I was thinking about that myth or idea that parents would sneak vegetables into their kids' dessert to trick them into eating them. So parents would put like spinach in a brownie and feed that to their kids. I think I read it in Diary of a Wimpy Kid or something. So then I Googled spinach brownies. I don't know why I needed to Google it. I guess I just wanted to confirm that it was real. And for some reason, this link popped up. Like, girl, that is not a brownie. You say it looks like a brownie, but don't be shocked. It's actually, that is not a brownie. That's spanakopita. That's not what I was thinking of. Have Americans never heard of spanakopita? We're just like, oh, it's in a pan. Brownies.